Conservative Party of Quebec, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, I will go over the Conservative Party of Quebec's platform, highlighting what I believe to be its relative strengths and weaknesses. We will see that the party's platform does not go far enough to seriously challenge the regime's hold on Quebec's political, economic, and cultural institutions. Nevertheless, with an upcoming fall election, the party is the best choice compared to the other awful options on the ballot. The authoritarian response from all levels of Canadian government to the Wuhan plague has been more or less in lockstep. Nominally conservative provincial governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick had, up until the recent brave actions by our truckers, been more than willing to go along with the WHO-inspired medicine mandates that relegated those who would not comply to second-class citizenship. The lack of pushback against the biomedical security state from both the federal Conservative Party and their provincial counterparts has led many Canadians to search for alternatives. At the federal level, Maxime Bernier's People's Party offered voters a genuine populist alternative to the flip-flopping, middle-of-the-road Tories and Aaron O'Toole. Despite being either ignored or demonized by regime media, Bernier was able to obtain 5% of the vote. I suspect, however, another 10% of voters in tight electoral ridings would have preferred Bernier, but held their noses and voted strategically for the Conservatives. Nevertheless, despite winning 0 seats, the PPC was able to steal enough votes from the Tories in enough competitive ridings to deny them a minority government and ultimately eject the two-faced O'Toole. At the provincial level, voters have also begun the search for alternatives to the Conservatives. Canada's 2 largest provinces, Quebec and Ontario, will hold provincial elections later this year. In Ontario, the True Blue Party and the Ontario Party were formed in large part as a response to their dismay over Conservative Premier Doug Ford's response to the pandemic. Neither party has yet to release a comprehensive platform, but when they do, you can count on yours truly to analyze them for you. In today's episode, we will set our sights on Quebec. The Conservative Party of Quebec, or PCQ, led by former radio host Eric Duhem, has risen from near obscurity since its 2009 founding to 3rd place in recent polls, coming in 2nd place among the province's French-speaking majority. Much of the party's recent traction is due to its opposition to the health restrictions of the pandemic. Little attention has been given to other elements of its platform, hence the analysis that follows. Before moving on to my critique of the platform, I should state my belief that liberal parliamentary democracy is on its way out. We are headed towards a storm of economic and social upheaval, the likes of which has not occurred in living memory for those in the West. As declining living standards increasingly highlight the incompetence of our rulers, regime efforts to crack down on dissent will only intensify. The institutions associated with the maintenance of vibrant liberal political order, such as the media, judiciary, and academia, have lost any shred of independence and are now mere appendages of the regime. The repression of dissent will only intensify in the near future before the system eventually breaks down. What will emerge after the storm is anyone's guess, though many of the current institutions will no longer exist. This is not the place for an overview of how to organize society of the future. Check out Charles Haywood's Foundationalist Manifesto for one interesting alternative. The commentary that follows accounts for our current institutional framework and political realities, such as the division of powers between provincial and federal governments. The solutions I propose are admittedly palliative remedies to a global cancer whose vanquishing will take place on battlefields across the world in the years and decades to come. The PCQ platform we will be reviewing is the current version on their website as of March 14, 2022, and was adopted during the party's convention in November 2021. Section 1 of their platform is dedicated to healthcare, where 2 issues gain most attention. 1, government responses to future health emergencies, and 2, the financing of healthcare in Quebec. The Wuhan plague has given Canadian provinces 2 years of sweeping emergency powers, which have led to, among other abuses, the January 2022 banning of Freedom Convoy protests in Nova Scotia along highways and overpasses. And of course, Trudeau imposed martial law, freezing the assets of regime opponents in mid-February. The PCQ's proposal 1.3.1 stipulates that a Conservative government in Quebec would amend Article 119 of the Public Health Act, such that if a public health emergency is declared, it would only last a maximum period of 10 days. After that, an 80% majority vote in the National Assembly would be required to extend it for a period of 30 days. Similar votes on the extension would take place every 90 days thereafter. This is a sensible solution to the tendency of elected politicians to outsource their decisions to unelected public health officials. Doing so allows them to tacitly sign off on measures that violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms with little oversight. Forcing a vote with such a high majority threshold will force politicians to either give their seal of approval for posterity to unpopular and coercive measures or vote them down. The remaining 4 proposals in Section 1 pertain to the financing and administration of healthcare in Quebec. The Conservative Party correctly identifies an inefficiently run and bloated health bureaucracy as a problem, considering that healthcare is the largest component of the province's budget, with an aging population all but guaranteeing unsustainable spending increases down the road. Proposal 1.3.3 would increase the number of doctors the province's universities churn out on an annual basis. While increasing the number of spots in medical schools could help address the shortage of family doctors, a cheaper and quicker solution would be to recognize the credentials of doctors from other advanced countries who want to practice here. As it stands, the College of Physicians forces foreign MDs from advanced countries, except the US, to jump through hoops and compete for a limited number of residency positions before being able to become fully licensed. Increasing the number of residency spots, perhaps doing away with the residency requirement altogether for qualified doctors from advanced countries, would have been preferable. Yet the PCQ appears too scared of the doctors' lobby to even have this in their platform. Proposal 1.3.4 calls for the increased role of the private sector in Quebec's healthcare system. What is really being privatized here is the delivery of the healthcare services. The PCQ envisions having procedures and services at private clinics covered by government health insurance. This should, in theory, force public providers to improve the quality of their services now that users have the option of choosing a potentially better option. The ultimate effectiveness of this proposal will depend on the barriers to entry and regulations imposed on the private sector, which is not clearly addressed in the PCQ platform. This is nonetheless a step in the right direction in terms of limiting government waste and redundancy. Section 2 of the party platform is focused on the economy and public finances. Proposal 2.2.1 would reduce the provincial income tax by 2%, a drop in the bucket considering the combined provincial and federal marginal income tax rates for many Canadian provinces approaches close to 50% for middle-class families. Proposal 2.2.3 would abolish the 10% provincial sales tax on used goods, including cars. All this is fine, it conveniently dresses up the fact that the PCQ does not propose to lower this incredibly regressive tax for all other goods. Sales taxes disproportionately target the working class and should be scrapped entirely. I found this whole section to be incredibly underwhelming. The PCQ's failure to put substantive income tax cuts for families in their platform is mirrored by their unwillingness to cut the province's civil service down to size. Quebec's public sector is notoriously bloated and inefficient. I suspect its workforce could easily be cut in half without any serious decline in the quality of services offered. Mr. Duhaime's aversion to cutting the public sector may in part be related to his studies at the École nationale d'administration publique, Quebec School of Public Administration. Regardless, The unwillingness to drastically cut back on wasteful government expenses in an already overtaxed jurisdiction is inexcusable for a supposedly conservative political movement. Section 3 of the PCQ platform focuses on the family and starts off strong enough with the claim that, quote, "The family is the primary institution of our society and constitutes a centerpiece in the success of young people and in their development towards personal autonomy," end quote. Proposal 3.2.1 would give families a weekly allowance of $200 per child that has not yet reached the age of primary schooling. This will be paid for by gradually eliminating the currently subsidized system of daycare networks that are among the cheapest in North America, starting at around $8.50 a day for low-income families. Children should be raised in their early years by their family, not strangers. This allowance will make it easier for mothers to quit their fake office jobs and return to their traditional roles as teachers and nurturers. It will also provide an economic incentive for families to have more children. Proposal 3.2.2 offers additional financial incentives for large families, including what appears to be a Viktor Orban-inspired credit of $5,000 for the purchase of a minivan for families of 4 or more children. Also, families with more than 2 children would receive an additional tax credit, though the amount is not specified. Proposal 3.4.4 attempts to deal with the high cost of new housing by deregulating the construction industry, in particular, dropping the licensing requirements for many tradesmen. Existing skill requirements are not particularly onerous. Many construction jobs, for instance, require an 8-month course in carpentry. This is, however, offered by the government at the ridiculously cheap price of $500. The hours from this course also go towards a worker's hours as an apprentice on their way to becoming a journeyman. Therefore, this proposal strikes me more as a way of filling the construction industry with cheap labor. Work with one's hands has tremendous virtue and value, and if anything, the trades should be financially encouraged, not devalued. Section 4 addresses the environment and natural resources. Here, the PCQ positively sets itself apart from all other provincial parties. In stating its values on the subject, the party refreshingly refers to its members as, quote, optimists and not alarmists. We take into account the many catastrophic forecasts formulated in the past, which turned out to be simplistic and erroneous models, end quote. And, quote, the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Quebec requested by the United Nations can only have a negligible effect on the future climate of the planet, end quote. Proposal 4.2.1 states that, unlike the current CAQ government, the Conservatives would support the development of Quebec's shale gas industry. It also signals a greater emphasis on economic benefits in the approval process for any future projects that develop natural resources. Proposal 4.2.2 would take an axe to boondoggles that the state-run utility, Hydro-Quebec, is currently dabbling in. Most notably, the PCQ would stop offering subsidized feed-in tariffs to the inefficient and ugly wind farms that have been popping up across the province. Wind power is completely unnecessary in a province with so much hydroelectric potential. Every windmill is nothing more than a religious symbol, a monument to the sun monster, asking him to spare us from his wrath. Good riddance. Proposal 4.2.5 promises to implement the lowest possible carbon tax on consumers. The implication here is that provincial governments have their hands tied since the Supreme Court's 2021 ruling that a federally mandated carbon tax on provinces is constitutional. Nevertheless, the PCQ could have prefaced their resolution by restating their opposition to a carbon tax in principle. Federal Conservative Party leadership frontrunner Pierre Poilievre is promising to scrap the carbon tax. So let's hope that this becomes a moot point in the near future when Princess Trudeau is sent packing. Proposal 4.2.7 recommends huge reforms to Hydro-Quebec, the state-run utility, under the guise of productivity. In a nutshell, these reforms would lead to price hikes for consumers and businesses. This is a terrible proposal. Over the past 60 years, Hydro-Quebec has been able to harness the province's vast hydroelectric potential and pass the benefits of this cheap and renewable source of electricity on to its consumers. Hydro-Quebec has the cheapest electricity in North America, yet generates annual profits in the billions. A just society should allow its citizens to share in the riches of their country. Workers should benefit from the lower costs inherent in a plentiful energy source. Mainstream economists argue that artificially lower prices are inefficient since, taking electricity as an example, consumers would be willing to pay more, sometimes a lot more, to keep the lights on and their homes heated. The extra profits from these higher prices should, in theory, go back into the industry in the form of investment and lead to increases in productivity, etc. Historical precedents, however, suggest that these extra profits would simply go straight into the pockets of hedge fund managers and billionaire investors in the form of dividends, while ordinary consumers get shafted. Finally, I have yet to come across any convincing evidence that Hydro-Quebec is managed less efficiently than utilities in other jurisdictions that charge much higher rates. Anyone with data to back up this claim is free to leave a link in the comments below. Section 5 addresses matters related to education and freedom of expression. Many of these proposals, though interesting, strike me as worded in an intentionally vague manner so as to allow potential supporters to draw whatever conclusions they wish from them. For instance, Proposal 5.2.1 appears to support charter schools by giving, quote, all parents the right to choose whether their child should enroll in a school in their neighborhood or another, or even in a private school of their choice, end quote. Parents in Quebec already have the right to send their children to public schools in other neighborhoods. It is implied that in giving all parents, i.e. including the poor, the right to send their kids to private schools, some sort of voucher system would be implemented. That this is not explicitly stated suggests to me that this is pure posturing. Proposal 5.2.2 offers moderate protection to free speech on college campuses. However, as I will outline shortly, the most effective way to combat those who censure dissent is to go after those that propagate woke ideology in the private sector, something the PCQ for now is unwilling to consider. Proposal 5.2.3 provides subsidies, again an unspecified amount, to parents who homeschool their kids. This is certainly welcome to any family trying to get their kids out of degenerate government schools. The most glaring omission to the proposals in Section 5 are prohibitions to the satanic sexual grooming of school children in the province. The province's current curriculum teaches kindergartners how to masturbate and encourages 6-year-olds in grade 1 to discover their gender identity. Many parents are not even aware of this, and I would suspect a plurality of Quebecers would oppose teaching this material to children at any age, let alone early primary students. This is a definite vote-getter, and the PCQ's unwillingness to examine the subject is odd. I suspect that much of the party leadership, including Mr. Duhem, an open, though not flamboyant homosexual, are social liberals and see nothing wrong with grooming the next generation of degenerates. With enough pushback from party members, this may change. The PCQ also misses the mark by failing to defund a major source of livelihood for those who have wrought the current clown world, academia. Many university programs are inherently useless. Most of the social sciences, as currently taught, consist of third-rate, poorly written propaganda directed against Western civilization and the patriarchy. The province should find creative ways of allocating funding to institutions based solely on the number of students enrolled in a socially useful discipline, such as engineering, the trades, preventative medicine, and so forth. Perhaps a tiny minority, say 1% of those currently enrolled, can receive scholarships to study philosophy, political science, and sociology. This will separate the few who are genuinely interested in these fields as a career from the vast majority of students who take them as majors because they suck at math and still need the social validation that comes with a university degree. Fake disciplines such as gender studies will receive no acknowledgement or funding whatsoever. Private institutions will be free to teach whatever nonsense they want, but the tuition will not be subsidized by the government. Finally, in focusing on free speech in an academic setting, the PCQ conveniently avoids any mention of the greatest source of censorship, media and the private sector. The corporate media has devolved into nothing more than a regime mouthpiece and devotes much effort to delegitimize and destroy any sources of dissent. This was on full display during the trucker protests as networks and newspapers doxed ordinary Canadians guilty of the crime of having legally donated $50 to the cause. Provincial governments have far more power over the media than they let on. The PCQ should therefore withhold government advertising to any woke newspaper, radio, or TV station. It should actively encourage dissent and hire rabble-rousing commentators at the state-run public broadcaster Télé-Québec. The PCQ can attack cancel culture by encouraging all medium and large businesses to adopt a freedom of conscience charter. Companies adhering to this charter would be prohibited from firing employees simply because of comments they made based on their religious or political convictions. Provincial agencies and all other state employers would be required to adopt this charter, though this would be optional for the private sector. However, the provincial government would only transact with companies that have adopted this charter. Additionally, any financial service intermediary that debanks a client due to reputational risk will lose any existing government contracts. Finally, the government should use the weight of its $400 billion public sector pension fund, the Caisse de dépôt et de placement du Québec, to divest from corporations that have done the most to attack freedom of expression, such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Corporations that do not sign on to the Freedom of Conscience Charter and repeatedly fire employees in Quebec for thought crime will also face divestment. Section 6 is devoted to the spicy topic of language, culture, and immigration. Surprisingly, I found all the proposals in this section to be more or less in line with other mainstream parties in the province. The usual list of grievances includes an unspecified reduction in the annual number of immigrants, better French instruction for English-speaking students, and a stricter enforcement of the province's language laws. Liberal, PQ, and now CAQ governments have tried similar strategies for decades, but to little avail, as the percentage of French speakers of European ancestry becomes smaller and smaller with each passing year. In many respects, the Conservative Party of Quebec's attempts to save French-Canadian culture from assimilation epitomizes the contradictions inherent to classical liberalism. The PCQ is a firmly secular political movement which places a heavy emphasis on autonomy and personal freedom, yet at the same time wishes to increase the birth rate of native Quebecers and maintain the province's language and culture. They may choose one, but they cannot have both. Only a handful of nations, such as Hungary, Poland, and Russia, have successfully managed to reverse declining birth rates without resorting to immigration. Family and tradition have a far greater role in these societies than currently exists in much of the West. Any sustained increase in Quebec's birth rate must be anchored on the traditional nuclear family. This requires a shift in culture which will not happen overnight. Quebec is Canada's least religious and most socially liberal province. Radical feminism and sexual degeneracy have infected much of the media and culture, and I see no indications that the PCQ intends to challenge this status quo. The moderate incentives proposed by the party to increase fertility are welcome, but likely insufficient absent a broader paradigm shift. Despite the party's many shortcomings, the Conservative Party of Quebec remains the best political option for opponents of the regime in this fall's provincial election. In the medium term, the party's deficiencies may be addressed by attempted reforms from within. Strategically, it makes no sense building a new party from scratch when the infrastructure already exists in the form of the PCQ. Regime dissidents should join the party. It costs only $15 for a year. And then draft and vocally endorse proposals as outlined in this podcast. This will force the PCQ to take an explicit stand on issues such as telling 6-year-olds to discover their gender or the divestment from woke corporations. The PCQ's success in the fall election is predicated on both the economy and subsequent new variant-induced waves of the virus. If the government does not reimpose health restrictions and the economy does not fall into recession by the time of the election, I predict the PCQ will fare poorly, generating under 10% of the vote and winning no seats in the National Assembly. However, if authoritarian health restrictions make a comeback or inflation starts to bite, the PCQ may begin to make serious inroads in Quebec provincial politics.